We're in the maintenance and troubleshooting area of the 1911 Armorers course. So let's talk a little bit about some of the issues that do arise with this weapon system. First off, the primary culprit that causes issues is the magazine. You need a good quality magazine, and what happens with a lot of the magazines is they're kept loaded, either the spring fatigues or the feed lips widen. So you want to check to make sure things are somewhat within spec and that the spring isn't getting weak. A lot of times on the 8-round magazines, because originally the gun had a 7-round magazine, the 8-round magazine, the last round won't feed because the magazine spring isn't keeping up. Another culprit that occurs is the recoil spring. And I'll tell you, with the recoil spring, they're probably not being changed as frequently as they should be. I see them quite frequently. This is kind of a quick way to disassemble the gun. But we see a recoil spring that is all bent and twisted up, or it's substantially shorter than an original spring. Now, as we're talking about recoil springs, again, I used to recommend replacing recoil springs on a 5-inch government model about every 3,000 rounds. I think a lot of times it depends on what type of shooting you're doing. If you're doing a lot of fast and furious shooting, you're going to wear out that spring more. What wears springs out is friction, heat, and working the spring material. So you can imagine, if you touch the top of the slide, how hot the weapon is, how much hotter it is underneath the barrel where the recoil spring resides. And so you can really wear out a recoil spring fairly rapidly by firing the weapon system repeatedly and fast. And so you're going to need a new recoil spring. They're fairly cheap. It's a good idea to get new ones. You can buy them through Brownell's. Wolf ones are always good. The original factory weight on a 5-inch government model is a 16-pound spring. And that's generally what I stay with. Unless you're going to be shooting plus P 45 ammo, then you may want to go to one of the 18-pound springs, but I usually don't like those. I usually stay with the 16-pound original spring design, original mainspring, and keep it that way, as that seems to be the most reliable way to run the weapon system, at least in my experience. Now, with the commander length gun, the 4¼ inch length gun, usually we'll go with an 18 to 20-pound spring, and obviously that spring, since it's shorter, you're going to have to replace more frequently. Especially in an aluminum frame commander, you might need to replace that spring every 1,000, 1,500 rounds. When you get to the officer model, the spring is shorter yet. The factory standard is 22 pounds. I usually buy the 24-pound Wolf one, but I've seen those springs wear out within a couple hundred rounds if you're doing a lot of rapid firing. So the spring and replacement, the order of how you do things, is very important. The Defender, because it has a compound recoil spring system and is a smaller spring inside another spring, doesn't seem to be as troublesome with springs as the officer model, but it will wear out springs quicker than obviously a government model. You're talking a spring that's not much longer than that, and so you're still shooting the same size ammunition, and obviously it's going to wear out. So in those, somewhere between 500 to 700 rounds, I think I would be replacing the spring. Now, those are kind of the main culprit areas to look at. Ammunition is, of course, always an issue no matter what weapon you're firing, but the magazines and the recoil spring right off the bat are things that I tend to look at. And it's amazing how resistant to problems a government model will be. It will feed and function with a spring that if you pull it out, it can be 1.5 inches shorter than an original factory one, and if you actually have a spring weight, you'll find out that it can be as low as 12 pounds, and the weapon system will still work, sometimes giving you a misfeed on the last round. Obviously, you need to replace that spring. Now, as we're talking about maintenance and other things that you can do to prevent problems, you need to do what a lot of times armors call an LTI, a limited technical inspection of your weapon system every time you take it apart. Look for anything that's a little unusual. Here are the most likely culprits that are going to cause you problems. First off, let's talk about the firing pin retaining plate. This plate on the back here that holds the firing pin in place traditionally cracks on the left side. That thin area right next to the firing pin will crack through. Now, it doesn't happen very often, but once in a while, after that left side is cracked, the right side will crack through. And if that happens, the bottom of the firing pin plate falls away. Sometimes you'll lose the firing pin. It'll fly out of the gun, and if you're behind it, it's going to fly into maybe something important. So you want to check that. When you're taking the gun apart, I always like to look, sometimes under magnification, to see if there's any cracks on that left side. And again, this is from the shooter's perspective, and it's the thinnest area. If you do have a problem with that, there are a number of good hardened firing pin stops that you can buy. The bulletproof ones from Wilson, Brownells carries them, and those are the Wilson bulletproof ones. And then there's some other models that are out there. Sometimes those need to be fitted. Now if they do, they end up being tight on the right side, usually up against the extractor. So you're going to need to take a file out and actually file one side down. Let me show you basically the area that we're talking about, just so that you kind of understand what I'm talking about. As we take this firing pin retaining pin, again, it's kind of hard to show here. Maybe it might be easier under this darker background. This area right here is very thin, and that's the area that'll get cracked. And usually you can look inside under good magnification and you'll see that it's cracked. When you buy an aftermarket one, it'll be slightly oversized, and you may need to file this right side here, sometimes this area here also, in order to get it to fit. You don't want to make it too loose, because one of the advantages of an oversized firing pin stop is to hold the extractor in place. One of the issues that happens with this weapon system is that the extractor moves during the cycle of operation. If the extractor moves, it's a lot of times called clocking. It releases some tension on the round that it's extracting, and you can have a misfeed or a failure to eject or even extract. That can create a problem. So one of the things you can do is put an oversized firing pin stop in, fit it in place so that it's up tight and it holds the extractor in place. The next most likely item to break on your gun, or an item that you'll notice during a limited technical inspection, is going to be the slide stop. And it just depends on the brand, but a lot of times you'll see that this lobe here snaps and breaks off. When that happens, this lobe is what holds the slide stop in your weapon system. Basically, this bears against the slide until you get to this disassembly notch right here, and that lobe has to pass by that disassembly notch. And if you look at it, you'll notice that it matches up. So if that lobe is gone, the possibility exists that the slide stop could basically be pushed out by your finger. If you're riding your finger up against the frame and you push on this side, you can just push the slide stop out, and if it falls out, the slide's going to come off the gun and the gun's going to come apart. The gun will generally still function if the slide stop stays in, but obviously it's not going to lock open on the last shot, because this lobe is what engages your basic slide stop or follower on your magazine. Right here, the lobe of the slide stop bears right here against this magazine follower, and as this rises up after the last shot, it pushes the slide stop up, and that's what locks the slide to the rear. So these have a tendency sometimes to break. A lot of people don't notice it. They'll say, my gun's not locking open on the last shot. You think it might be related to either the magazine getting weak or the recoil spring being worn, and in fact, you can do a quick visual inspection by locking the slide to the rear, look down into the magazine well, and you'll see that this lobe is missing. Those are some of the more obvious parts that can break. Obviously, you could also have an extractor break. This is fairly remote. I don't see it that frequently where an extractor actually breaks off the rim, but it could happen as it's feeding, and then that extractor breaks off against the rim of a cartridge or something. We used to see it more frequently years ago because people didn't know any better, and they used to drop load their guns. They would lock the slide to the rear, drop around into the chamber, and go ahead and rack the slide forward. When that happens, the extractor has to snap over the rim. And remember, this is a controlled round feed delivery system, so the original way it's designed to feed and the way that it keeps the parts from breaking is as the breech face strikes that round and feeds it out of the magazine, it's supposed to come up underneath the extractor, not the extractor snapping over the rim. So if you don't know the provenance of your gun and you don't know what the person's done that had it before, you may want to keep an eye on that extractor and make sure that they weren't drop loading the gun, because some people still do it even to this day. But that's a fairly easy item. Now, those are the most obvious items that can give you some grief, but there's all kinds of other ones. As an example, the original grips are designed to hold the plunger tube in place. This plunger tube can come loose, and one of the tools you need to work on it, and we'll show it in a little bit here, is this plunger staking tool. And basically you take the grips off and this fits over it. I'll explain it a little bit, but how do you know if your plunger tube is loose? Well, what I usually do is I have the slide in place, making sure the Series 80 lever's down, and I put my thumb right next to the top of the plunger, usually with the stock panel off, and I just move the safety up and down. And if I feel it wiggle or move a little bit, then I know that it's become loose. The other thing you can do, obviously, is you can sit there and wiggle it with your fingers. Sometimes it's real hard to tell, but that's something you need to check, especially if you have stock panels that don't cover the plunger tube. What's going to happen if the plunger tube comes loose? Well, it's kind of an unfortunate thing, because what happens is generally the back of the plunger tube comes loose, it lifts up, and the plunger pops out and pins the thumb safety in the on position. The only way to get it off is to get your fingernail in there and push the plunger forward and pop the thumb safety down. And you don't want to have that happen. So what I usually do on my weapon systems before I put them in service is I preventatively stake this plunger tube again, just to make sure it doesn't come loose.